Alexander Reed stared at his reflection in the mirror of his father's expansive Manhattan penthouse bathroom, adjusting his Italian silk tie for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 28, he had never known a day of real work in his life. His calendar consisted of charity galas, board meetings where he played on his phone, and lavish vacations funded by his family's seemingly endless fortune. "Mr. Alexander?" Henderson, the family's longtime butler, knocked softly on the door. "Your father requests your presence in his study immediately." Alexander's stomach tightened. William Reed III never requested presence. He demanded it, and being summoned to the study never ended well. The last time had been when Alexander had crashed his third Ferrari in 6 months. "Tell him I'll be right there," Alexander called out, running his fingers through his perfectly styled hair one last time. The walk down the marble hallway to his father's study felt longer than usual. Family photos lined the walls, generations of Reeds who had built their transportation empire from a single horse-drawn carriage in 1889 to the multi-billion-dollar Reed Transit Corporation of today. Alexander's own photo, taken at his Harvard graduation, seemed to mock him as he passed. He found his father standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan sprawled out before him like a kingdom. William Reed III didn't turn around when Alexander entered. In the reflection of the glass, Alexander could see his father's stern expression, the same one that had graced countless magazine covers and business publications. "Do you know what this is?" His father's voice was quiet but sharp as he held up a tablet displaying what appeared to be security camera footage. Alexander's blood ran cold as he recognized himself in the grainy video, stumbling out of a nightclub at 3 a.m., getting into a shoving match with paparazzi before being pulled away by his security detail. The headline below the video read, "Reed, heir's latest scandal. Drunken brawl ends in property damage. Dad, I can explain." "Explain what exactly?" William finally turned around, his steel-gray eyes boring into his son. "Explain how you've managed to make headlines again for all the wrong reasons. Explain how you've embarrassed this family for the last time." Alexander felt his face flush. "It wasn't my fault. Those photographers were—" "Enough!" William's hand came down hard on his mahogany desk. "I've had enough of your excuses, Alexander. You've had every advantage, every opportunity, and what have you done with it? Nothing but squander it all on parties, women, and childish behavior." "That's not fair," Alexander protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I attend all the board meetings. I show up at company events. You show up physically, yes, but your mind, your dedication, your understanding of what it means to be a Reed." William walked around his desk, picking up a thick folder. "Do you know what this company means to this city, to the thousands of employees who depend on us for their livelihoods?" Alexander shifted uncomfortably. He knew the numbers, of course. Reed Transit Corporation employed over 10,000 people in New York City alone, operating everything from bus lines to subway maintenance contracts. But he'd never really thought about the actual people behind those numbers. "I've made a decision," William continued, his voice heavy with finality. "You're cut off, effective immediately." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. "What? You can't be serious. Your credit cards have been cancelled. Your trust fund is frozen. Your apartment lease will not be renewed next month. The only thing you'll keep is your health insurance and a basic checking account with enough to cover modest living expenses." Alexander felt the room spinning. "This is insane. You can't just—" "I can, and I have." William's voice softened slightly. "This isn't a punishment, son. It's an opportunity. An opportunity to learn what this company is really about, from the ground up." He handed Alexander an envelope. Inside was an employee ID card and a set of instructions. "You'll report to the Queens Bus Depot tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. You're enrolled in our driver training program. For the next 6 months, you'll live like any other entry-level employee. No special treatment, no shortcuts." Alexander stared at the ID card in disbelief. "A bus driver? You want me to be a bus driver?" "What I want is for you to understand the backbone of this company, the real people who make it work every day. William sat down heavily in his leather chair. You have two choices, Alexander. Take this opportunity to learn and grow, or walk away entirely. But know this, if you walk away from everything. Your inheritance, your position in the company, all of it. The weight of the decision pressed down on Alexander like a physical force. His whole life, he'd never had to worry about money, about work, about anything real. Now, standing in his father's study with an employee ID card in his trembling hands, he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. What's it gonna be, son? Alexander looked at his father, then back at the ID card. His reflection, in its glossy surface, showed a man he barely recognized, a man who had never known what it meant to earn anything in his life. Fine, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. William nodded once, his expression unreadable. Henderson will help you move your essential belongings to your new apartment in Queens tonight. The address is in the envelope. Remember, 5 a.m. sharp tomorrow. As Alexander turned to leave, his father added, "And Alexander, don't disappoint me again." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like the end of everything he'd ever known. As he walked back down the hallway, past the generations of successful Reeds watching him from their frames, Alexander Reed felt something he'd never truly felt before, fear of the unknown future that awaited him. Little did he know that future would teach him more about life, love, and the true meaning of success than all his years of privilege ever had. The Queen's apartment building loomed before Alexander like a monument to everything he'd lost. The yellow brick facade was weathered, the small lobby dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. His new home was a far cry from his luxury high-rise in Manhattan, where a doorman had greeted him by name and a concierge had catered to his every whim. His essential belongings, as defined by Henderson, filled exactly 2 suitcases. Gone were his designer suits, replaced by the practical clothing the butler had deemed appropriate for his new position. The apartment itself was a stark studio with basic furnishings. A bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a kitchenette that barely deserved the name. Alexander's phone buzzed. It was Sophie, his girlfriend, or rather the woman he'd been dating for the past 3 months. "Darling, there must be some mistake." Her voice dripped with concern that felt more performative than genuine. "The concierge says your apartment is being cleared out?" "It's not a mistake," Alexander replied, sitting on the edge of his new bed. The mattress creaked underneath him. "My father has made some changes. I'm taking on a new role in the company." "Oh? Which executive position?" Alexander swallowed hard. "Bus driver trainee." The silence on the other end lasted so long he thought the call had dropped. Then came a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You're joking, right? This is one of your pranks." "No, Sophie, I'm serious." Another pause. "Well, call me when you've sorted this out with your father. I simply cannot be seen dating a bus driver." The call ended before he could respond, though he wasn't sure what he would have said anyway. He stared at his phone screen until it went dark, then set his alarm for 4 a.m., a time he usually saw from the other side, stumbling home from clubs. Sleep proved elusive that night. The unfamiliar sounds of Queens, distant trains, voices in the hallway, the rattle of the ancient radiator kept him tossing and turning. When his alarm finally blared, Alexander felt like he'd barely closed his eyes. The pre-dawn air was bitter cold as he walked the 6 blocks to the Queens bus depot. The massive garage complex sprawled across several city blocks, buses lined up like sleeping giants in the darkness. A group of people was already gathered near the entrance, many clutching travel mugs of coffee, their breath visible in the cold air. "You must be Reed." The voice belonged to a stocky man in his 50s, his Reed transit uniform worn but immaculate. His name tag read, "Frank Martinez, senior instructor." "Yes?" "Yes, sir," Alexander replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Frank's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a hint of skepticism. "Follow me. Training starts now." The next 4 hours were a blur of safety regulations, vehicle specifications, and operational procedures. Alexander's head spun with information about brake systems, turning ratios, and blind spot management. His classmates, a diverse group of 8 other trainees, seemed to absorb everything with eager attention while he struggled to keep his eyes open. "Read!" Frank's sharp voice snapped him to attention. "Care to repeat what I just said about proper mirror adjustment?" Alexander fumbled for an answer, but came up empty. A few of his classmates snickered. "This isn't a luxury you can sleep through," Frank said, his voice hard. "Lives depend on what you learn here. If you're not serious about this, there's the door." Heat crept up Alexander's neck. For the first time in his life, his family name wasn't a shield, it was a target. During their lunch break, Alexander sat alone, picking at a sandwich he'd bought from a vending machine. He overheard snippets of conversation from his classmates, stories about previous jobs, family responsibilities, dreams of stable careers with benefits. Their world was so different from his, yet here he was, trying to bridge a gap he hadn't even known existed until yesterday. "Mind if I join you?" A woman about his age stood by his table, holding a Tupperware container. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her smile seemed genuine, if cautious. "Sure," Alexander replied, grateful for any friendly face. "I'm Maria Gonzalez," she said, sitting down. "You looked like you could use some real food." She pushed half of her homemade sandwich toward him. "Thanks, but I couldn't take it. My abuela would be horrified if she knew I let someone eat vending machine food when I had extra." The sandwich was simple, turkey and cheese with fresh vegetables, but it was the best thing Alexander had tasted in days. As they ate, Maria told him about her previous job as a school bus driver in New Jersey, and how this position with Reed Transit could help her put her younger sister through college. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you here?" Alexander hesitated. How could he explain his situation without sounding like the privileged heir he was? "I needed a change, a reality check, I guess." Maria's eyes studied him with unexpected understanding. "Sometimes the best things in life come from the changes we don't choose." Before Alexander could respond, Frank called them back for the afternoon session. This time, they would actually board a bus for their first hands-on experience. Standing in front of the massive vehicle, Alexander felt a surge of panic. The bus seemed impossibly huge, nothing like the sports cars he was used to handling. Frank demonstrated the pre-trip inspection routine, showing them how to check every critical component before taking the wheel. "Reed, you're up first," Frank announced. Alexander's hands shook as he climbed into the driver's seat. The steering wheel felt alien under his fingers, the array of controls overwhelming. Frank sat in the instructor's seat beside him, his expression unreadable. "Take us around the lot," Frank instructed. "Nice and easy." Alexander took a deep breath and pressed the accelerator. The bus lurched forward violently, then stalled. Laughter erupted from behind him. "Again," Frank said calmly, "but this time, remember what we discussed about gradual pressure." 3 more attempts produced similar results. Sweat beaded on Alexander's forehead despite the cold. He could feel his classmates' amusement, hear their whispered comments. "That's enough for today," Frank said finally. "Practice the manual tonight. Tomorrow we try again." As Alexander gathered his things at the end of the day, his body aching from tension and unfamiliar movements, Frank approached him. "Your father called," the instructor said quietly. "Wanted to know how you did today." Alexander's stomach dropped. "And? I told him the truth, that you're struggling, but you haven't quit." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Listen, Reed, I know who you are, and I know why you're here. But in this depot, your last name doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're willing to learn, to work hard, and to earn the respect of the people around you." Alexander nodded, the words hitting harder than he expected. "See you tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp," Frank said, turning away. "And Reed, bring a better attitude. You might actually learn something." Walking home in the gathering dusk, Alexander felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. His phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from friends, wondering why he wasn't at their usual hangout spots. He ignored them all. In his tiny apartment, he sat at the small table and opened the training manual Frank had given them. The words blurred before his tired eyes, but he forced himself to focus. For the first time in his life, he couldn't buy or charm his way through a challenge. He would have to earn it, just like everyone else. As he studied, the sounds of Queens at night filtered through his window, the rhythm of the subway in the distance, the conversations of neighbors in the hallway, the genuine laughter of people living real lives. Alexander Reed, heir to a transportation empire, was learning what it meant to be just another person trying to make it in the city his family helped build. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would reshape not just his understanding of the world, but his very identity. 2 months into his training, Alexander was beginning to find his rhythm. The pre-dawn walks to the depot no longer felt like a punishment, and his hands had developed calluses from daily vehicle inspections. He'd mastered the basic operations of the bus, though Frank still watched him like a hawk during practice runs. That morning, as Alexander performed his routine pre-trip inspection, he noticed Maria looking troubled as she checked her own bus. "Everything okay?" he asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Maria hesitated, then shook her head. "My sister's medical bills came in yesterday. The scholarship covers tuition, but—" She trailed off, her usual confidence wavering. "I'm picking up extra shifts at my second job, but it's still not enough." Before his fall from grace, Alexander wouldn't have thought twice about someone's financial struggles. Now, after weeks of budgeting his modest salary, he understood the weight of every dollar. "I could help," he offered, then quickly added, "Maybe cover a shift or two once we're certified." Maria gave him a small smile. "Thanks, Alex, but I'll figure it out." "I always do." Their conversation was interrupted by Frank's arrival. "All right, people, today's different. We're taking this training to the streets." A murmur of excitement rippled through the group. They'd spent weeks practicing in the depot's lot, but real New York streets were another matter entirely. "Reed, you're up first," Frank announced. "Route 15 through Queens. Let's see if you're ready for real traffic." Alexander's heart raced as he guided the bus out of the depot. The morning rush hour was beginning, and the streets were filling with commuters. Every turn required precise calculation. Every stop a careful assessment of clearance and timing. To his surprise, he found himself enjoying it. There was something satisfying about navigating the massive vehicle through tight spots, about the responsibility of carrying passengers, even if they were just his fellow trainees for now. Then it happened. A taxi cut across 3 lanes without warning, forcing Alexander to brake hard. His classmates lurched forward, and Frank grabbed the handrail. "Good reaction," Frank said, nodding approvingly. "But remember, you've got to anticipate these things. In this job, you're not just responsible for yourself." As they continued their route, Alexander noticed something that would have escaped his attention 2 months ago. An elderly woman at a non-designated stop, struggling with grocery bags in the rain. Without thinking, he pulled over. "Reed, what are you doing?" Frank's voice was sharp. "This isn't an authorized stop. She needs help," Alexander replied, already opening the doors. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, was grateful for the ride. She reminded Alexander of his own grandmother, though he hadn't visited her in months. As he helped Mrs. Chen with her bags, he caught Frank watching him with an unreadable expression. Back at the depot, Frank pulled him aside. "That stop wasn't in the manual." "Reed, I know, sir. I'm sorry if I—" "Sometimes," Frank interrupted, "being a good driver means knowing when to bend the rules to help people. Just don't make a habit of it." There was a hint of approval in his voice. That evening, exhausted but satisfied, Alexander decided to visit his father's office. He hadn't spoken to him since that day in the study, and something in him had changed enough to want to bridge that gap. The Reed Transit Corporation's headquarters seemed different now. He noticed the maintenance workers buffing the marble floors, the security guards checking IDs, the late-night cleaning crew, all the people he'd previously looked through rather than at. His father's secretary, Ms. Thompson, looked startled to see him, especially in his training uniform. "Is he in?" Alexander asked. "He's in a meeting, but—" She stopped as voices approached from the conference room. The door opened and Alexander froze. His father emerged, accompanied by Bradley Thompson, Sophie's father, and one of the company's major shareholders. "This is unacceptable. William," Bradley was saying, "your son's little stunt is affecting shareholder confidence. The board is concerned about succession planning." "The board's concerns are noted," William replied coolly, then stopped short at the sight of his son. Alexander stood his ground, suddenly aware of his worn uniform and work boots against the pristine corporate backdrop. "Well, speak of the devil," Bradley sneered. "Playing bus driver getting boring yet, Junior?" Before Alexander could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Reed, there's been an incident at the Queen's depot." Frank Martinez strode out of the elevator, still in his instructor's uniform. His expression was grave. "What kind of incident?" William asked. "One of our trainees, Maria Gonzalez, was attacked while working her second job at a convenience store. She's in the hospital." Alexander's world tilted. "Is she okay?" "Stable, but she'll be out of training for weeks, with medical bills and her sister's tuition." Frank trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Bradley Thompson made a dismissive noise. "Well, that's unfortunate, but hardly a matter for corporate attention. William, about our discussion—" "Actually," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself with the steel in his voice, "it is a matter for corporate attention. Maria is one of our employees, trying to put her sister through college while training to serve this company's passengers." He turned to his father. "Did you know our entry-level employees often need second jobs to make ends meet? That some of them can't afford basic health care despite working full-time?" William's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held something Alexander hadn't seen before: interest. "This company talks about serving the city," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger. "But how can we serve New York if we can't take care of our own people?" Bradley scoffed. "Listen to him, William. 2 months as a trainee, and suddenly he's a champion of the working class." "No," Alexander replied. "I'm someone who's finally learning what this company really is. Not just numbers on a spreadsheet or stock prices, but people. Real people who make everything work, who keep this city moving every single day." He turned to Frank. "Which hospital is she in?" "Queen's General. I'm going there now." Alexander started toward the elevator, then paused and looked back at his father. "You once told me to understand the backbone of this company. Well, I'm starting to, and I think we can do better." As the elevator doors closed, Alexander caught a glimpse of something he'd never seen before, a small smile playing at the corners of his father's mouth. At Queen's General Hospital, Alexander found Maria in a shared room, her sister Carmen asleep in a chair beside her. Maria's face was bruised, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Alex, what are you doing here? What are friends for?" he said, pulling up a chair. "Besides, I think I might have an idea about those medical bills." As he sat there, listening to Maria's worried talk about expenses and recovery time, Alexander Reed realized something profound. 2 months ago, he wouldn't have cared about any of this. Now he couldn't imagine not caring. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie asking if he'd come to his senses yet. He deleted it without responding. There were more important things to focus on, like the stack of hospital forms on Maria's bedside table. And the way forward, he was beginning to see more clearly than ever before. The fluorescent lights of Queen's General Hospital cast harsh shadows as Alexander pored over Maria's medical bills and insurance documents. It was nearly midnight, but he couldn't leave. Not when he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the problem facing his family's employees. "Alex, you should go home," Maria said softly, adjusting herself in the hospital bed. "You have training in the morning." "Actually, I have an idea about that." He looked up from the papers, his eyes bright with purpose. "But I need your help, and not just yours." Over the next few days, while continuing his training, Alexander began gathering stories. He spoke with veteran drivers during break times, listened to maintenance workers between shifts, and stayed late to talk with cleaning crews. Each conversation revealed another piece of a puzzle he'd been too blind to see before. One morning, as he completed his practice route with Frank, he finally shared his plan. "I want to present a comprehensive benefits reform proposal to the board," Alexander explained, carefully navigating through morning traffic. "Healthcare improvements, educational assistance, childcare support, real changes that could make a difference." Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching Alexander handle a tricky turn with newfound confidence. "The board won't like it. It'll cut into profits." "Maybe," Alexander agreed. "But what's the point of profits if we're failing our own people? Besides, I've been running the numbers. Happy, secure employees mean better service, lower turnover, fewer accidents. It could actually save money in the long run." "And your father? What does he think about all this?" Alexander's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I haven't told him yet, but I will." That evening, Alexander found himself back in his father's study, but this time, everything felt different. The same photos lined the walls, but now he saw them differently, not just as symbols of success, but as reminders of responsibility. William Reed III sat behind his desk, examining the thick folder Alexander had just placed before him. "You've been busy," his father remarked, flipping through the pages of data, testimonials, and financial projections. "I learned from the best," Alexander replied. "You taught me that this company is about more than just profits. I'm finally beginning to understand what that means." William leaned back in his chair, studying his son with new eyes. "Bradley Thompson and his faction won't support this. They'll fight you every step of the way. Let them." Alexander's voice was firm. "I've spent the last 3 months learning what this company really is. Not from spreadsheets or board meetings, but from the people who make it work every day. They deserve better, and we can give it to them." A small smile played at the corners of William's mouth. "You sound different." "I am different." Alexander gestured to his uniform, now worn with pride rather than shame. "This wasn't a punishment, Dad. It was an education, and I'm not finished learning yet." William stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city he'd helped shape. "The board meets next week. Bradley's been pushing for a vote of no confidence in my leadership, citing concerns about succession planning." He turned back to Alexander. "Think you're ready to prove them wrong?" "I know I am." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Alexander split his time between training — he was nearly ready for his final certification — and refining his proposal. Maria, now released from the hospital but still recovering, helped him organize testimonials from fellow employees. Frank provided crucial operational insights that strengthened the financial projections. The morning of the board meeting, Alexander stood in his tiny Queens apartment, staring at the suit Henderson had delivered, his first since being cut off. But as he reached for it, his eyes fell on his uniform hanging nearby. After a moment's consideration, he made his choice. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander entered wearing his driver trainee uniform. Bradley Thompson's face turned an interesting shade of red. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley demanded. "This is a board meeting, not a costume party." "This uniform," Alexander said clearly, "represents the backbone of Reed Transit Corporation. The people who make this company work day in and day out. I'm here to talk about them." For the next hour, Alexander presented his proposal. He showed charts demonstrating how improved benefits could reduce turnover and accidents. He shared stories of employees working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. He projected long-term cost savings from a healthier, more stable workforce. "This is absurd," Bradley interrupted. "We're not running a charity. Our responsibility is to our shareholders." "Our responsibility," Alexander countered, "is to the city we serve and the people who serve it. How can we expect excellence from employees we're not willing to support? How can we demand dedication when we show none in return?" He turned to address the entire board. 3 months ago, I was exactly what you all thought I was. A spoiled heir who didn't understand the first thing about this company or its people. My father's decision to send me to driver training wasn't just about teaching me humility. It was about showing me what Reed Transit really is. Alexander clicked to a new slide, showing faces, drivers, mechanics, cleaners, all the people he'd come to know. These are the real assets of this company. Not our stock price, not our profit margins, but our people. And it's time we invested in them. The room was silent when he finished. William Reed III stood slowly. I move to adopt this proposal, he said firmly. All in favor. Hands began to raise, slowly at first, then more quickly. Bradley Thompson and his closest allies sat with arms firmly crossed, but they were outnumbered. Motion carries, William announced. The benefits reform package will be implemented immediately. As the board members filed out, some stopping to shake Alexander's hand, Bradley Thompson approached with a scowl. You're making a mistake, William, he snapped. Both of you. This company won't survive this kind of soft-headed management. Actually, Bradley, William replied, placing a hand on Alexander's shoulder. I think this company is finally in exactly the right hands for the future. Later that evening, Alexander returned to the Queen's Depot for his final training session. Frank was waiting for him. Heard about what happened at the board meeting, the instructor said. Word travels fast. Good news, I hope. Frank smiled, the first real smile Alexander had seen from him. You did good, kid. You did real good. As Alexander prepared for his final certification test, he realized that everything had changed. Not just the company's policies, but him. The spoiled heir who'd walked into this depot 3 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. What he didn't know was that the biggest challenge and the most important lesson was still to come. On the morning of his final certification test, Alexander arrived at the Queen's Depot an hour early. The pre-dawn air was crisp, and the familiar sounds of buses being prepped for their daily routes filled the yard. He stood for a moment, taking it all in. The smell of diesel fuel, the calls between mechanics, the quiet determination of early shift drivers preparing for their routes. This place, which had once felt like exile, now felt like home. Ready for the big day? Maria approached, now back on light duty after her recovery. The company's new benefits package had covered all her medical expenses, and her sister's tuition assistance had been approved under the Educational Support Program. As ready as I'll ever be, Alexander replied, checking his uniform one last time. Frank emerged from his office, clipboard in hand. All right, Reed, this is it. Full route, real passengers, real conditions. Show me what you've learned. The test route would take him through some of Queen's busiest corridors during morning rush hour. As Alexander completed his pre-trip inspection, he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about passing a test. It was about proving he'd truly changed. His first passengers were a mix of early morning workers, students, and elderly residents. Each person who boarded was more than just a fare now. They were stories, lives, responsibilities. He helped an elderly man with his walker, waited patiently as a mother organized her children, called out stops clearly and professionally. Halfway through the route, he spotted a familiar face at one of the stops, Mrs. Chen, the woman he'd helped in the rain months ago. She smiled broadly as she boarded. My favorite driver, she said warmly, patting his arm as she passed. Traffic was heavy, but Alexander handled each challenge with practiced ease. A delivery truck blocking a turn, a cyclist weaving through traffic, a sudden downpour that slicked the streets. None of it rattled him. Frank observed silently from the back, making notes on his clipboard. Near the end of the route, Alexander approached a non-designated stop. A man in an expensive suit was waving frantically, clearly late and desperate for a ride. 3 months ago, Alexander would have seen himself in that man, entitled, expecting the world to bend to his convenience. He drove past, pulling up to the proper stop 100 yards ahead. When they finally returned to the depot, Frank took his time reviewing his notes. The silence stretched unbearably. Well, Frank said finally, I suppose we should make this official. He held out his hand. Congratulations, Driver Reed. The pride Alexander felt in that moment was unlike anything he'd experienced before. This wasn't an achievement handed to him because of his name. He'd earned it. Every step of the way. That afternoon, he had one more stop to make. His grandmother's nursing home was exactly as he remembered it, though he now noticed details he'd missed before: the caring staff, the small kindnesses between residents, the dignity in simple moments. Alexander! His grandmother's face lit up as he entered her room. What a wonderful surprise! And is that a uniform? He sat with her for hours, sharing stories about his experiences, his transformation, the lessons he'd learned. She listened with tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly. "He started as a driver too, you know, before building the company." Alexander blinked in surprise. "He did. Dad never told me that. William doesn't like to talk about those days, but your grandfather never forgot where he came from. He used to say that every great journey starts with a single stop." She reached for a box beside her bed. "I've been saving these for the right moment." Inside was a pair of worn work gloves and an old Reed Transit driver's cap from the 1960s. "Your grandfather's," she explained. "Ubram's first year on the job." The next morning, Alexander reported for his first official shift wearing his grandfather's cap. As he guided his bus through the awakening city, he reflected on how much had changed. His phone rarely rang anymore. His old friends had drifted away when they realized his phase was permanent. Sophie had started dating a hedge fund manager. None of it mattered. During his lunch break, he received a text from his father. "Board meeting tomorrow. Need you there. Wear your uniform." The boardroom looked different now. Photos of drivers, maintenance workers and other employees lined the walls alongside the usual executive portraits. Bradley Thompson and his allies had resigned in protest of the new direction, but the company was thriving. Employee satisfaction was up, turnover was down, and service quality metrics were at an all-time high. William Reed III stood at the head of the table, looking more energized than Alexander had seen him in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," his father began, "I've called this meeting to discuss the future of Reed Transit Corporation. More specifically, its leadership." Alexander straightened in his chair, still proud in his driver's uniform. 3 months ago, I gave my son an ultimatum that I hoped would teach him about responsibility. What I didn't expect was how much he would teach us." William's eyes met Alexander's. He reminded us that this company's strength isn't in its stock price or its profit margins. It's in its people, all of its people. William picked up a folder. "Which is why I'm announcing 2 changes today. First, I'm stepping down as CEO." A murmur ran through the room. "Second, I'm recommending my son, Alexander Reed, as my replacement. Not because he's my son, but because he's proven he understands what this company really needs. A leader who knows every level of the operation, who respects every employee, and who never forgets where we came from." Alexander stood slowly, emotion thick in his throat. "Dad, I'm honored, but I have a request." "Oh, I want to keep driving one route a week, to stay connected, to remember what this is all about." William smiled. "Your grandfather did the same thing, you know, every Friday morning, right up until he retired." Later that day, Alexander found himself back at the Queen's Depot. Maria was there, now promoted to training coordinator under the new professional development program. Frank was reviewing schedules, looking pleased with recent performance improvements. "So, CEO, huh?" Frank said, trying to hide a proud smile. "Don't let it go to your head." "Not much chance of that," Alexander replied, checking his watch. "I've got the 5 a.m. shift tomorrow. Can't be late." As he walked home through the streets of Queens, Alexander Reed, driver, CEO, transformed man, finally understood what real success meant. It wasn't about power or money or status. It was about responsibility, respect, and remembering that every person, every job, every moment matters. He passed Mrs. Chen's stop, where she was waiting with her groceries. Without hesitation, he stopped to help her carry them home. Tomorrow, he would lead a billion-dollar company. But tonight, he was just another New Yorker, doing what needed to be done, one stop at a time. The next morning, as Alexander guided his bus through the awakening city, his grandfather's cap sitting proudly on his head, he knew he'd found something his privileged youth had never given him: purpose. In the end, his father's punishment had become the greatest gift of his life, the chance to understand what it truly meant to serve others, to work hard, and to be part of something bigger than himself. And that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. What would you do if you had to start your life from scratch tomorrow? How would you handle losing everything you thought defined you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire someone who's going through their own transformation right now. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Your support keeps this channel alive, allowing us to bring you powerful, life-changing stories every single day. And if you're ready for another emotional journey that will make you believe in the power of the human spirit, don't miss the incredible story waiting for you on the left. Trust me, it's a tale that will stay with you long after the video ends. Remember, every great story reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles and our triumphs. Let's keep sharing these moments together. See you in the next video. See you in our next video.